Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time. It's wonderful to be here with you. Tonight, obviously, we continue our journey in serving Christ's mission through parish pastoral councils. And whether you're on a council, never been on a council, or off a council and had 20 experiences of it, we really hope that there's something you can engage with in our time together tonight. So we're going to just begin tonight as we do each week. And so we're just going to pop up our little screen in terms of where we're going. So you can see there that we're in session 2 of 3. And we just start by recognising, acknowledging country. So although we are meeting virtually, we continue to acknowledge the traditional custodians that have, for thousands of years, walked upon and cared for the lands upon which we are all individually located. We acknowledge the continued deep spiritual attachment and relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this country and commit ourselves to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. And as we acknowledge country, we recognise that we are held in an even larger community that spans beyond space and time, that communion of saints. And of course, a communion into the heart of our God. Loving God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the gift of one another. We thank you for the amazing privilege it is to serve Christ's mission, to be in relationship with Jesus Christ, to know him, to serve him, to love him, to follow him. We pray that through the work of councils and bodies like councils in our church that seek to simply stand still at times, to be still, as Mary was still when Martha was busy, just to sit at the feet of Christ. Let us be still now, just to rest before Jesus, to acknowledge where we are, the space that we come to in this gathering tonight. Be aware of our own emotions, the thoughts, the physicality of ourself. And be present to how Jesus may be speaking to us at this moment through our own self and through the experience that we're about to embark on this evening. And that through all that we bring with us into this space, family, community, struggles in our world, struggles in our heart. Let us bring all this into this space, this sacred space of your individual communion with Christ, and recognizing that we join as brothers and sisters, all joined together in that same communion. May be open to the gift of your Spirit that continues to remind us that whatever is happening now in our present struggles is not the end of the story. The resurrection, the new life continues to follow, that hope springs eternal, that our councils and indeed each one of us are called to be ambassadors of Christ's mission in our world. Make these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen. So welcome again, and tonight we have, just for case there are some new people here, just a reminder that who you're dealing with tonight. My name's Richard McMahon. I'm the Director of Pastoral Planning in Parramatta Diocese, and accompanied tonight by Lisa Bright, our Project Officer in the Pastoral Planning Office. So we work here in the Chancery, which is the cool name for the cool kids, Chancery. So the name for the offices of the bishop in this diocese. And we, a lot of our work is involved with pastoral councils, and indeed over the last 20 years or so, I suppose, being connected in with many different versions and experiences of council. And so when we talk about best practice here and what we offer, it's a shared wisdom that we're drawing upon. And best practice too doesn't mean it's the end of the story, but simply that we are aware that best practice actually involves stopping like this and reviewing and renewing and sharing wisdom. So that's a strong part of what tonight is about. And we will continue to make all these slides available tonight. And a little trick that I have found in recent times is if you can see the number on the bottom right of your screen there with the slides, if they're up, sometimes when we're taking our notes, I just put that number next to it when I go back and get the slides afterwards. So if I've got extra notes to make. Fantastic. So a reminder about where we're going, that there's three main things that we're trying to cover across these weeks: the why and what of our councils, really important. Then how do we go about doing it, best practice. And last week we certainly looked at the why and what in a lot of detail. And tonight and next week, we're looking at those best practices. But if you're new, or if you are like me and forget what happened perhaps the day before this one, here's a bit of a sort of an overview about what happened last time. This is one of the final slides. We went through this a bit slower. We'll go through it quick now. So we talked about the two columns of church's communion and church as institution. And we talked a lot about models last week. Why did we spend so much time on that? It's because that if we don't get a good grasp on the why of what we're doing, then it really influences the way we go about it. Best practice will actually be ultimately affected by the very assumptions that we're operating out of. Now, I wasn't trying to sort of demonize one of the models over the other last week. We're just recognizing that these have evolved in the life of our church. Church as institution is an older model that has served a beautiful purpose in our church. And the more recent model that has come in is church as communion, sometimes a pilgrim church and other expressions, or the people of God, that came through Vatican II. And you can see up on screen the five approaches to council, or main roles of council, listed there: representative, advisory, collaborative, visioning, pastoral, very key aspects. They're either going to be seen as core work of the council, or they're going to be seen as perhaps an enhancement of the priest's role. So that's the important distinction we're trying to make here, that if we come out of a more institutional model, then the priest will see themselves, or the people sometimes in the parish around the priest, can see the priest as having their main job of doing those five things on the left. They represent, of course, the community of the bishop. They're the ones that really are the best at advising, because they're the shepherd, etc. And we could go forward. So that would be a priest-centric model in a sense, at the extreme end of a church's institution model. And so we get that language of council sometimes feeling that they're established to help Father. And I've sort of bolded a few things there. You may not heed their advice, that they're trying to help the priest out. The vision is mainly with the priest, and the council's trying to bring that to life, etc. That's a quite extreme sense of that institutional model. I'm exaggerating it a little just to get that taste of it. And then what Vatican II envisaged when it did establish pastoral councils was church as communion as the underlying way it was understood. And that's, you can see there, the way we were talking about last week, that this co-created vision, co-responsible in terms of decision making, etc. Consensus. So those words become far more critical. So it's no longer an enhancement, but it's actually seen as essential in the life of a parish. It's seeking to establish a more communion-centred model. The other thing I should state about this before we move on is that we're all on a bit of a spectrum here. And from one day of the week to the next, sometimes we might veer one way or another, or we might feel a bit of a muddle in the middle. So we all pick up different resonances and can act out of different spaces because these two models coexist. And as I said, I'm simplifying them dramatically for the purposes of the short time we're together. So don't go away and sort of start, making this the only way of seeing the world. That would be very sad because it's not what I'm doing. I'm just trying to at least put some flag posts up. Okay, so the final thing is, and then we're going to break you into groups, is just to checking in, I suppose, on your feedback on the role and function of the council. So last week, when we come back from this little session, we're going to put up a little slide that shows us a little bit about what you were saying last week in terms of your thoughts on what the role and the function were, but we're going to group that when we come back from the break in terms of what we see as those 5 areas of being advisory, etc. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be moving to groups just to, again, these are the groups you'll stay with tonight. We'll break up a few times during our time together. There'll be short breakouts. Tonight, just as we go together, we want to begin by introducing yourself, the name, where you're from, and we're going to just take a little bit of time to share a new learning, insight or question that you bring to our discussion on parish pastoral councils. So Lisa's going to open those rooms for us now, and it's also in the chat. These questions are in the chat for you when you go. So please join the chat, and you'll see a click to join, and off you go. See you back soon. Thank you. Fantastic. Welcome back, and I hope it's you've got a good discussion going already. We're going to ask you, as we've done last week, to start putting some of your questions or your wisdom into the chat, as we did with the email last week. We then try to compile that and send that out to you. And so please, if those questions, if they can start coming through, we can pick them up, hopefully during the session, or some of that wisdom we can tap into as well. So please, anything that came out of your conversation so far, just start adding that to the chat as we continue on. That'd be wonderful. And Lisa will prompt me as we go through with some of the things that are coming through as we see them relate to what we're sharing. So let's get back to see what the slides are inviting us to consider. And we can see here that last week we looked at these 5 areas, as we mentioned. All the information underneath there is what you said. So you said that these are the things that are important. So I think I remember Len saying, let's not be a workhorse. And Lisa did a great job of just grouping these under these 5 headings. To live beyond a priest after a 6-year term. So that says something about visioning. You could argue that some of these things even go across more than one of these areas, but we tried to fit them in just so you can see how it relates. So just a moment just to read through that. All your words are underneath and they connect into these 5 key areas. And what we wanted to do with this is, as we said, each week we're going to sort of play with this a little bit more, but just, I suppose the most important point when Lisa was doing it, she said to me that what she was noticing is, well, what she was wondering, I think, was, do some of us sometimes might think that the council is only one or two of these things, for instance, or we emphasize just one of these at the exclusion of others, etc. So it's part of the challenge sometimes is, how do we keep all these in tension, or how do we connect them all together? So that's what we're certainly wanting to do tonight as we continue on, is to think about how each of these things that we're talking about here is honoured through best practice. So having a look at best practices, before we go any further, bit of reading here, but I'll just read through this a little bit with you, because I was thinking to myself, if I had to go away after these 3 sessions and do something in my parish, what would I do first? So before you even think any more about what we're going to do with best practices, let's think about walking away and who we're going to talk to. So one, I would suggest that I think our parish priest here tonight from the community. He didn't make it tonight. Okay, any priest here tonight? Give us a call out. As a deacon?
I think there is.
Okay, so Deacon John, welcome. So what we're saying here, what's important first off is that we need a parish priest in the room with us, obviously, to do anything that might renew or change our pastoral council practice, and anyone else with influence. So usually, if Lisa and I are doing any work with parishes, we will start with, and in fact, I'm doing work with the diocese at the moment. So the first person I wanted to talk to is the bishop. And then we talk to anyone else there that that we can bring into the room that we know will be important in terms of either supporting the pastoral council process moving forward, or would potentially get in the way of it if they were left out and then were brought in later. So we have to identify some key people and bring them into the room where it happened, as they might say in Hamilton. So the second part is then the suggestion for doing this may be, because we might, the priest might say, well, what do you even want to talk to me about all this for, or the pastoral council chair, etc. So it can be just something as simple as, look, I'm wondering if it's a good time to review our parish pastoral council. What's working well? What can we improve? And we could give some examples perhaps that come out of these sessions. The blue is talking about if you don't have a council at all. So that's a different sort of approach where you might say, I know we haven't got one, just wondering if we could explore it. And I've heard of some successful approaches. Why do we sort of nuance the language? Because usually the parish priest or someone else with influence has had an experience of council, particularly if you haven't got one at the moment, and it hasn't worked out well. So we've got to try to say there's another way perhaps we haven't explored yet, and can we at least sort of get together and have a chat? We've got to get over that threshold. And at the meeting then, we've got an opportunity to get an agreement, first of all, what model we're operating out of. And so I had to ask that of this bishop I was talking to recently. I just said, so where do you come from? Are you a sort of person that likes to sort of say to the council, this is the direction we're heading? Or do you like them to interrupt you? Are you okay with that? Do you like their feedback? Do you like them to help shape vision with you? And he's paused and he said, these are really good questions. I've never really thought about that. And then he could start articulating where he felt he came out of. I didn't even mention models to him. I just sort of started to get back to all the stuff we talked about last week, because that's going to be critical, as we keep saying. Now, if people can shift their model too, and he was quite open. He said, well, that's how I come at it. Are you saying there's another way? And that became an interesting conversation even there. So once we say that there's a number of ways of doing things, we can open up a conversation. The next thing that's important then is to, we can use this language of saying we're going to review what's happening in our council at the moment, or a review of the former experience, perhaps, if we've come out of different councils in other parishes, etc. We can talk about that before we actually get going. So that helps expose our assumptions or what happened in the past. And then, of course, we can move into some sort of renewal process. So that just gives us a little insight into where we should start from, so that we don't just go away, as I sometimes go away from things and think, I don't know where to start. Well, this is a great starting point, I would suggest. We talked about in the email last time of all these different areas: a good formation, running good meetings, listening, discerning, conflict, plans, etc., relating to whole bunches of people and what to do between meetings. So it'd be great if we could solve all this tonight, but we'll put some pointers up for you. But what I wanted to do, rather than to try to deal with each of them separately, because our time doesn't really enable that, we want to ensure that these things we're talking about here honour those principles of being representative, advisory, collaborative, visioning, pastoral. And so I'm proposing that you don't really get much of a say in this, so you can tell which model I'm coming out of right now, but that we go through this by looking at 3 key stages. Basically, one is the setup or the renewal of a council, and then its whole experience of discernment. And we can see that discernment captures so much of this. If renewal or establishment might talk about, okay, well, how can we do all these things to start with? The discernment space captures a lot of the work of the council, of a discerning body. Let's think about that in terms of being advisory, how we advised, how we collaborate, how we vision, all that comes out of a discernment space. And then our planning is obviously then bringing these things to life beyond us, beyond what happens in the council. So that's how we're going to go about it. And we're going to just have I'll give a bit of an overview of the first of these areas. We'll break into small groups, come back, see how we go with that and get some feedback, then on to the second and on to the third. So that's the trajectory tonight. Okay, so the other thing that just to mention, we couldn't resist finding some cool smart art for this from PowerPoint, but we see that these processes, of course, go around like many things in life as a circular sort of thing. We renew, we then move into this process of discernment as a council, but we don't want it to end there. The fullness of discernment, of course, does involve planning and action. But we take that out as a core part of what we want to do as a council, that our visioning has to be expressed sacramentally. It has to come to life. And then we don't just end there. We have to hear how that's going and renew again. So if we're using that as our principle, let's dive into the first of these, renewal and establishment. So how do we go about renewing, establishing parish pastoral councils? Well, some don'ts. I'd suggest that, first of all, we don't go, gee, we've had some really good 3 sessions recently. Might go back and encourage us just to dissolve the council because it hasn't been working that well, hasn't been meeting for a few months, etc. People are a bit tired and grabby, so let's just get rid of it, whoever can. We know that's going to create all sorts of problems. So one way around that is sometimes to do a bit of renewal, and people sometimes self-select to go, or we can open it up to a renewal process and saying, well, we're up for our nominations again. You can nominate if you want to stay on, but we also invite new people to come and nominate. And then there can be a more gentle renewal. Don't introduce the second point there. We don't introduce this whole renewal or establishment without engaging stakeholders. Because if I get this great idea as a parish priest, or I'm in a role to do something here, and I just charge in and do it because it sounds so cool, people will end up being spectators, not participants. We might find we don't get much investment. So you've got to talk to quite a few people first about how we're going to go about this renewal and bring them in before we even start. Concerns and resistance, sometimes we see them as negatives. I think they're awesome because that's engagement. It's part of change management. If people start to say, I don't understand this, or this is wrong, I don't agree with you, it gives us an opportunity. That's a doorway, and we can have a conversation. If we dismiss them or just say, look, listen, this is the way we're going, so we just have to get on board for the ride, people will harbour those concerns and that resistance, and when you least expect it, that's going to come back to bite us. And don't short circuit the process. So we don't want to just jump into elections and appointments. And because, I mean, we can sometimes be tempted to think we'll just jump into a new council, and it's a lot easier if you just appoint some people that you know, or maybe let's just get the whole community involved through an election. These things sound good and have been used in parishes, but they come out of that institutional model, because the appointment in particular is not really an open process. And you can see here too that because who actually makes those appointments and how do they know that they're actually open to the whole community? We don't know. Sometimes there could be other people out there putting their hands up, but if we just appoint, we'll never hear from them. Elections, I would say, have even more concerns, because they can be about a popularity contest, or certain minority groups can miss out altogether. And so that sense of diversity that councils need can be lost. I was in one parish and it was mainly teachers that were elected through the process because everyone knew that a Catholic teacher would know something about their faith. And so no one else on the list really got in except for, I think, an acolyte or two, because they also saw that acolytes knew something about their faith. So it was really skewed. You had a bunch of teachers and a couple of acolytes through an election process. So let's look at how we can get around that. So let's think about if you're establishing for a first time in particular here. This works too for renewal. We'd start by, we'd suggest establishing a preparation team. So before we go much further, and that, so usually those people I mentioned earlier that have influence in the parish. So it could be definitely the parish priest would be on that. And there might be, say, another key person working alongside the priest as a staff member, etc. Could be a deacon, could be a couple of people in key roles in ministry, coordinators of a couple of your ministries, could be just a couple of influential people in the parish that have a lot of energy in this space. And they get a little team together, particularly when you haven't got a council. Now, some of these, interestingly, could transition to be pastoral council members going forward, but we start with this little team. It's really important, and this is widening your circle. As we said before, it's not just pushing through renewal. We've got to at least convince a couple of key people in our parish that this is a good idea. Now, this group has the task of really getting the whole show going. So they'll decide on things like your guidelines, timeline, how the selection process is going to work. We can give you more materials on this outside of this session, but you can get the idea that they've got to get the whole show running. And these are the elements then that this group decide upon. The whole community has to be informed early on. What's happening? Who's involved? Who's involved on that preparation team? The timeframes, how they can engage in this, what the guidelines are, how selection is going to work. And I would suggest this sometimes takes a good month of putting out bulletin notices. Parishes that try to do all of it in 1 week before and then get everyone in, they say, we only got a few people come up. Well, one thing is not everyone comes every week to Mass. Sometimes people only hear the message after it's been repeated about 3 or 4 times, etc. So, and that also gives time for the word to start to spread around. So we don't rush into this. That informing process is critical and will take time. At the same time, we're inviting community into prayer. They're seeing this as something important now. This is a whole community engagement. They're understanding more about what the council is. They're understanding that this is something to pray for. This is significant. And we're looking for recommendation of possible members. Now, this is a really tricky thing here, because we're not saying we would invite you now to nominate. We don't do that. What I've found is if you ask people to nominate straight out, it again reduces dramatically the number of people, because they don't quite know what they're signing up for. And sometimes they don't think they're holy enough. Sometimes they don't think they'll have enough time. Sometimes they're just not sure if the council does anything, etc. So what we're suggesting here is it's a thing to start recommending possible members. Say, oh yeah, you might be interested. And to have people that have any sort of role in the parish, come along, or interest, or if you've been energized by your life in the parish, etc., come along. And what are they going to come to? We're going to invite anyone, especially those possible members, to an information session. It's a bit of a Q&A evening. We'll hear more about the council, but particularly tying the council into the life of the community. Now, I'm only giving you the highlights here. We'll give you a whole handout with more information about each of these steps. But you can hear how we've slowed down the whole process here, that we haven't just bunged it all in one go and said, sign up here if you're interested, and then we're going to quickly go to narrow it down to appointments. Then we can hold a discernment session. Sometimes people concertina the two, so they'll put the information session and a discernment session. But what we're doing is, by giving people enough information early, that gets their interest levels up, their engagement up, and then you can usually get a discernment session which might have about 20 people come rather than 5 or whatever for your community. And in that discernment session, we go through, it's a very prayerful process of hearing about each of the people that have come, their gifts. We talk more about the role of the council in even more depth. And everyone is hearing from one another because it's a smaller group. And it's that group itself then can actually discern who amongst its members are best to move on to the council. It takes time. It can be a 2-hour, 3-hour process. It actually works. This is actually a process that the church has used in various places through its history. Religious orders, etc., use this. So again, we won't go through the detail of that, but here, but we can give you some of the step-by-step processes about how that occurs. And you can hear that when we do this, I'll just give you a snapshot of one I did recently. We had the first 3 members were selected from the group, and then we looked at them and we said, okay, at the moment it's 3 males. This is the diversity that we've got. We haven't got any females at the moment. Let's go back now to discern the next group of 3. And we already had heard everyone's gifts, what everyone was bringing. And then when people selected, they came back with the next 3, and that changed the dynamic again. And then we looked at the 6 that were up on the board and we say, okay, now what's missing still from that diversity? What voices do we still need from the group that's remaining to bring in? So you can see the power of it, that it starts to formulate it from the group who's most intentional, most invested, has really stayed the course to understand what the council's about. Some people say, but gee, what's happened to the rest of the community in this? Well, they could be praying for this process to be happening. They could have come to that information session that's been transparent. And if they're told from the beginning, this is how it works, people usually find that people actually think this is quite an interesting experience, and you don't get pushback as much as you might think. We get to the end of that process and we move to commissioning, which is very important. So that's a sense of how we go about the establishment of councils. When we come back, we might actually move it to a break now, because when we come back, I just want to touch on renewal, but I think it's maybe a good time to move to groups, and we'll just see what you're hearing so far, just in that process of establishment, because it can be a significant departure from what you experience, or maybe you're all over this, and then we'd love to hear that too, because that will enrich, and you might send some resources around after this session too. So Lisa's going to open the group, and Lisa, do you want to talk about what they're going to be sharing here?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. So in the chat function, you'll see the 2 questions there, that what are you hearing, thinking and feeling? And what are some ways from your own experience, from what you've heard from what Richard has shared, where you've seen some of these things happening? You may have been part of discernment process yourself, and how that experience was for you. So I'll open up the groups, and we'll only have about 5 minutes for this. Just to ensure that everyone gets the opportunity to share. We won't be feeding back in the larger group like we did last week, but we'll be encouraging you to share in the chat function. Again, share as much as you can in the chat function. So I'll open those rooms now for you.
So in terms of where we have left off, we're talking about just establishment of the councils. And as part of establishment, of course, you might be a council that's looking at not so much establishment, but you might be thinking, well, we're about actually renewal. But it pretty much is the same thing once a council is established. It might become quite a similar thing in terms of what could happen next. Because obviously, if you have a new council starting up, then you will be obviously wanting to look at what you can do next. So let's just have a bit of a squiz at that. So we'll just put up a little screen there. So you can see just some of the things that happen in that renewal space. It's obviously important to get to know each other a little better. Now, the process here isn't simply, of course, for wanting to know each other for the sake of being good friends on the council. It gets all the way back to what we we're talking about in terms of being a synodal council, or that sense of communio. We learn a little bit of our limitations in that space too. And we learn a bit about our life experiences. We're not just talking issues, we're talking about the very people that we're encountering on the council. It's all about relationships, as we hear quite a lot. So this becomes a very important part of saying, well, why is it that I'm more task driven, for instance? Why is it that I'm more open to shared experience? And I think we've even had an example here in that feedback after the break. Some people come out of very different experiences. Some people here would be very much just wanting to absorb and think. Others are very much wanting to input and engage. The second point here is to a shared understanding of the role. Now, you might think this is a bit crazy because you've just been through a period of establishing and forming a council, but we don't really know what people have absorbed. So you've got to go through the work again early on in a renewal phase of making sure everyone's on the same page. It's a bit of the work we've been doing here last week and this week, the why and the what, the how. The gifts and talents of members is sometimes an area that can be overlooked. It's a bit like I was talking about before. There's little processes. Again, we can flag some of these, and we'd be interested if you've got your own that can be used in this space, identifying our gifts, leadership styles, etc. Obviously, the operation of the council in the parish, that varies from parish to parish, and the relationships do as well. So some of those areas about how we relate to the priest will be different, or how we relate to the finance committee. These will need to be explored and identified, and also get agreement from, of course, those groups. And finally, the prayer and formation, which we'll be moving on to now. So just some of those areas for renewal. And just checking in with Lisa, did things come back from the chat or from people that you wanted to highlight for us? There's one here, Lisa might just check on some others, but a few of you are asking that area of amalgamation of councils. What happens there in terms of, do you just have the one council then, or if you've got a large parish with maybe 3 mass centres? The experiences that I'm aware of, at least, that seem to work best is with amalgamations or with a couple of parishes twinned, etc., or maybe a huge parish with about 3 mass centres, is that sometimes you have 3, you don't have to call them parish councils, but if say if there's 3 distinct centres or 2 centres, that you keep 2, you can call them community groups or something like that, or 2 advisory groups, 1 for each of the segments of the new parish, the community of communities, just to gently transition, and they would feed into the larger council. So you don't immediately dispel what was there before, because we don't want to lose the sense of community of communities. And I hope that's probably enough as a clue as to a good way forward. But we can take that offline, and again, if others have had that experience, we can talk into that. But that has been, I've seen where amalgamations have occurred where there's just been no sense of the individual communities left, and so they sometimes still need that time, and so over time they might be able to move on and only have that one council for the whole. But early on, they need to transition gently into that space. And so having a voice out of each of the individual communities can be really key, as long as it feeds into a heart of one council. Lisa, was there another couple of points there?
Yeah, so Charles shares too. So the place of statutes, like a framework. So does that come first? Part of, you talked about the preparation team. So is the framework of statutes essential at the very beginning, so people know what they're working towards? And he asks if there's a diocesan model, which there is. So I'll ask you to speak to that.
Yeah, so there is a diocesan model. That's something we'll put on our list of things to share with you, our the statutes that we have available. And it is important to have something established first, so people know what they're walking into. Not everyone's pretty keen for the idea of having create statutes on the trot, so they want to walk into it. But there is a provision to review, and sometimes the council, once it's established, will look over those statutes and say, well, there's a few things we think for our parish or our community that we would change, and depending on your diocese, in our diocese we would suggest that they come through to the diocese for the sign off. And that's not just so we can be big brother, but sometimes we find that councils can lose one of the important aspects of who they are by changing their statutes, and we can at least have a conversation with you. So I hope that gives you a bit of it's just a sense of where we're coming from with that.
Well, thanks. The place for retreats. So Teresa asks, should PPCs have mini retreats, for example, twice a year? And Jerry and Crystal ask something similar. Can you give examples of ongoing prayer and formation that might be appropriate for parish pastoral councils?
Terrific, and that's a good segue perhaps into our discernment segment. So I think with the renewal in particular, a retreat or a whole day, when we talk about when we bring councils together initially, we would be encouraging a whole day away somewhere. To really, it takes time, doesn't it, to get to know each other. It takes time to get a sense of gifts, talents, to really sit down and chew the fat, say, well, and if it's been a review, we're saying how things are going. Our Diocesan Pastoral Council is actually having one of these on Saturday, whole day. Len, I think, is here tonight, he's talking about, time to breathe. We need time to breathe. And then once we got to know each other, we've established that well, we get on to the business of the council during the year, but we come back to that retreat day. It's a beautiful thing to really strengthen us, and as an annual experience in particular, of a number of parishes. And if you've got good experiences of that, please, that can be information you can send us through as well for us to share. So we might move on with that to that space of the discernment. And in that space of discernment, I suppose what we're thinking about here is a very broad space in terms of what can happen in the life of the council. So the first thing about this is I want to actually focus it in on the meeting structure, which might seem a bit strange, but I think that if we're going to discern well, we need to do it at the very time that we gather. And then that will echo out, and we'll see how that can happen. So one of the things that I am very strong on, I know not everyone is do not include any other business in your meeting. We don't want to crowd a meeting. If a meeting is supposed to finish at 9 p.m. We don't want to add other items just at 2 minutes before 9 and say, oh, now, is there anything else people wanted to share? We know that's best handled if the executive's functioning well, agendas going out asking for that to come in from the members about what should be included on the agenda. If everyone has agreed to that as a process, then it's a lot simpler and it just eases things up for your meeting. As you can see, it's a nice white screen at the moment. We try to keep agendas simple and focused, not crowded. Sometimes there's a lot of information items. They can be included, but they don't need to be discussed, as we know. So if there's nothing that we're going to do with an item beyond just being informed, then we don't want it to occupy airtime, usually on a council agenda. So what might we be doing then? Some time for welcome and opening prayer. Apologies, obviously, minutes, these normal sorts of things. A big chunk of our meeting, though, is listening to the Spirit and that time for formation. So this is, if it is, we talked so much last week about the council in a sense being the heart of the body of Christ. So it's like the oxygen moving in and out, or the blood moving in and out. If that's happening, we've got to be listening, don't we? We have to listen to that body to see where that movement is happening. So that's going to happen on a number of levels. We basically want to stop and sort of say, what are we hearing and how are we responding? This is particularly first and foremostly, and there can be different orders to this, but through our scriptures, through our faith life. Talk about having an extra chair at the table sometimes at the meeting. So as we're going around and we get to the empty chair, well, then we have to pause because it's the word of God needing to speak now. So we pause for scripture, or we might even pause in the conversation during the meeting as we get round to that person. We think, oh, let's just more intentionally just focus back in again into what the Spirit is saying to us here now. So we come to a pause, we stop. What are we hearing? How are we responding? Those of us in plenary who have experienced that space see how intentional they make that actually. So after they have discussed something, then they actually pause and say, so what actually are we coming to as a joint space of where the Spirit is saying? Obviously, the listening to the Spirit isn't simply through scriptures, or perhaps if we're doing something on welcome in our pastoral council, we might jump into some church documents on that, or something out of the Benedictine tradition, something out of some recent thing of Pope Francis, etc. But you can always have that time of formation, particularly though to wed it to our agenda is key. The second point here is listening to the Spirit, the voice of the people. So who are we listening to? When we come to make any decisions or conversation in the meeting, who have we actually listened to before we discuss? And who is missing from the conversation? So if we've got an agenda item talking about some aspect of parish life, a lot of our work between meetings might be having to go out and ask people that question. So sometimes best practice can be the agenda item is about, we're really looking at the engagement of the school and parish. Well, let's go out and talk to people. So each council member might have to go out and talk to people. We craft a good question around that, and it goes out in the bulletin. We say to the whole community, this is what the council's deliberation is, and we want to hear. So when we come, we have quite a rich sense. Each council member is actually representing, and that advisory, all those roles that we're talking about start to come to life. And what are we hearing when we go and talk to people? We're recognizing we represent others, so we might disagree violently with what they're saying, but we have to honor that when we come into the council space. And we can't be prejudiced, so we need to be aware of our prejudices and sometimes even make that open in the meeting to say, I'm finding this really difficult, but a lot of people are saying this, and I need to tell you as a group that I don't agree with what I'm hearing even. And that's a space of vulnerability and trust that we're trying to develop in the council too. And of course, how are we responding? So a lot of the work of the council, while that's happening in the meeting, then happens between the meetings. In our roles, we start to become these people who engage and listen intentionally to our community. And the voice of the people isn't just in the pews, of course, as we know. So how else might we be eliciting that voice? And we know that we can grab that information through lots of data and social profiles. Sometimes we can do it through other means as well, and they can be a bit more challenging, but they're also available. So we will pause again now. The final part of that discernment is actually in the plan ourselves, and as we attend to our planning, which is the final thing we wanted to share tonight, which is a part of the agenda too, of course. But I would suggest that an agenda and that discernment and the agenda, you can see that it threads through a whole meeting. It's not that we just park it at the beginning and then get on with the meeting, that we slow the meeting down, and that there's something that weaves through everything that we're sharing in an agenda if possible. That it's very intentional formation, and it's very intentional gathering in of the wisdom of the whole community in whatever that we're sharing tonight. The formation from the scripture or tradition focuses on that, the wisdom of the people, and then we bring that in to breathe life into whatever we are planning. So we'll pause there again, and let's go back to our groups, and I'll pass you back over to Lisa.
So again, in the chat function, you'll see the questions. What are you hearing? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? And again, from your own experience, as we heard, there's so much wisdom in that you do have in those small groups. Share those experiences of what you've heard, those best practices. And then when you come back, please share them in the chat function when you return to the larger group so we can share that wisdom with everyone. So you'll have 5 minutes. And again, I'll open those rooms now. Welcome back, everybody. Again, as you're coming back, I invite you to share your comments and questions in the chat function. Anything we don't answer tonight too, we'll record those and we'll feed them back during the week, or we'll answer those next week together. But just a few questions that were asked before you went away. Jeff asked the question, what is and could be good practice now seems to have been affected by COVID. Are we being realistic by talking this way at the moment? I would say yes, because we have a very practical example. I know there's some people here from the community, St. Luke's community at Marsden Park, And in this last 6 months, they have established a pastoral council using the process that Richard is talking about tonight. So if you want to see and hear about how that works, Annette is here tonight, and Deacon Tony isn't, but I think there's one or two other members from their community, but I'm sure they would be happy to have a chat with you to say, how does this process work? And not only did they do it, they did it during COVID, they did it online as well. They did it part online, they did it part face-to-face, again, following all COVID regulations. And whether at a time they thought, no, we can't do this, they did it. So hopefully there's an article coming about around that in a few weeks in Catholic Outlook too. So yeah, let's not be stopped by COVID and those regulations. We work around it. We work as to what's possible. So definitely it can happen because Marsden Park have done it, which is fantastic. Another question that came through was about, or a comment just saying that most pastoral councils have their statutes approved by the diocese, which is wonderful. So thanks for that information, John. Just as part of the statutes, often there's a bit in there that says that are renewed or looked at, refreshed each year at the parish AGM. So they might, one year they might not change, in a couple of years' time they might change. So it's always best practice to keep those statutes refreshed, and as they are refreshed, just to send them to the diocese to be or to be approved by the diocese as well. And again, we have those guidelines that we're able to send if your council does not have statutes or you are establishing.
Okay, so we've been skating across those three areas of renewal, of discernment, and then we're going to move just to touch in on planning. Again, we'll give you a little bit more information about each of these after tonight, and we'll be keen on your feedback. So in terms of we were looking at this area of discernment and saying that our agenda, and sometimes it's a very different way of thinking of agenda, that rather than crowding with a lot of things to do, how do we actually be still? How do we come back to that space of being Mary, of actually sitting with Christ at the heart of our community where everyone is very busy, and to listen in order to start moving into visioning, to planning, to responding. So you can see that last item there, and as you know, I mean, obviously we might shape our agendas a bit differently than this, but the spirit of this we want to have in our agenda is, how do we attend to our plan, bringing the mission of Christ to life through? So what could that possibly look like? Well, attending to our plan, bringing that mission to life, I'd suggest that once we've established a plan, and so you might have 3 goals, for instance, that we're operating, and we always suggest to parishes, don't get too excited and have 7 goals that you set yourself in the next year or so, that sometimes it's only 1 goal that we can get done, but we want to be a bit realistic. So say we had 3 goals there. When it comes to council, the council can be thinking at a very top level of how is this going? How is this part of the plan moving along now in light of our people, our vision and our mission, particularly if we've established a good vision and mission, which we haven't talked about much yet tonight, but we'll move into this planning in more detail. We have to keep coming back to that, don't we? Why we're doing what we're doing. Goals can get out of hand sometimes. All those actions can get out of hand. We forget the very thing that we started out with, why we were doing what we were doing. What else is needed after listening back into our tradition, back in through our scriptures, to the signs of the times, through listening to the people and the broader community? These goals sometimes have to shift and change, don't they? So for each of those goals, there's a patterning there. Now we might say, well, wait a sec, isn't the council supposed to be doing a lot of this stuff? Well, remember we said right at the beginning that we don't want the council to be hands-on. Getting back to Len's comment, a hands-off council. Now we know there's other models. We're talking mainly about this model of discernment. If we're going to be a discerning council, we've got to maybe establish 3 standing committees, 1 for each of those goals, which could feed into the council, which can have people on them actually acting through bringing those goals to life. You might have a couple of reps from your council on there too if they've got the time, but you usually other people then are engaged that can be intentional with moving forward with those goals, particularly people who are related in the ministries or areas attached to it to those goals. And that it leaves the council free to step back and listen and discern about what's happening with that goal and each of the goals that's operating. So let's just think a bit more about planning. So there's many ways to cut the cookie when it comes to planning, but we'll just take you through gently. This is a little 10-step guide. I'll just take you through the next couple of minutes. Again, we'll give you some a sheet on this one too. So obviously, who needs to help shape your vision, mission, and planning? So we talked about is if it's not just coming from one person, a best plan, of course, is what we call community engagement models, where the whole community gathers and shapes planning. You might think it's a bit hard to do. Well, I've seen parish communities do this, and so they do this through particularly having a half day or sometimes a Layla Park's a good example in our diocese has over the years has had a half a day they spend once a year just coming together and planning and discussing what's been happening and then looking at what can happen next. So there's some beautiful examples of parishes that try to gather as a whole and then do some shaping of vision, renewal, etc. And then they bring that back and the council might steer that forward. So you can get in some pretty good habits there. And AGM isn't just about reporting and sharing information. In fact, I'd suggest if we could move away from that, maybe ensure that you've got good annual reports to be given to people, but really have a big part of that day, besides honouring and celebrating what's happening, bring it over to moving into some sort of engagement strategy for people on that day about vision, mission and planning. And then, of course, the more people at the heart of these, you can bring together ministry coordinators, you can bring together pastoral council or reps from your schools, etc., into planning processes. So we really encourage to get a number of people involved with your planning, because otherwise we're doing something for other people. And again, they might end up being spectators and not participants in what we're trying to achieve. This is going to require some space, how we're going to go about it. Especially if we're not used to it, it can take about 12 months to really start doing it well. So we're not going to rush into it. Let's not get frustrated by trying to do everything too quick and finding we run out of time. We have been working with communities that are doing planning at the moment. As someone in the chat said, this can actually be perhaps a good time for communities now, if they've slowed down in some ways, to really look at themselves and think, okay, well, what do we need to do? And in fact, planning is pretty essential now because we have to change the way we do things. We have to reset ourselves. It can't be business as usual. Saying that, we always have to honour our current story. And I think I've already said this tonight, but it's important that we don't just reset. Planning isn't about saying, well, whatever happened before sounds that way. So the language can come out that way that we've got this great plan now, or vision for our community, and now for the first time ever, we're going to be, and everyone's going, really? But what's been happening for the last 30 years? So we've got to be very careful. So we take time to listen to people, but what's been happening in our story, and celebrating that as we come to we say, this is a new chapter now. We've talked about that reading the signs of the times and being formed by church teaching. So there's lots of movements happening in the church, lots of information to be gained in social profiles and other movements about what's happening in the church now that we have to be attentive to, that we bring into our planning. And then we can start casting a vision. Again, when we give you this information, we'll have some points underneath each of these. These are just the headlines for you. And one of the beautiful expressions we've come across is that a vision can be like a postcard that you paint for yourself or with a number of people in your community. And the more detailed and attractive you can make that, then that's what you start to walk towards over the next 3 years. So what's the picture that we're painting for ourselves that we want to be able to, that people will engage with, get excited by, when they say, this is where we're moving, everyone go, oh, wow, I want to be part of that. And the more people that we share that vision with, they might say, but what about this? You're missing this in that picture. We can say, yeah, okay, we could probably put that in there too. And it starts to shift and change. So it can be quite an exciting time. And then once we start to have that clear picture of our vision, we again want to see what's happening already. One of the things we find is some of the real dangers in planning is that we forget. We say, oh, it'll be really awesome if we do something now with young people. And we forget that we've already got a couple of youth groups going, or there might be something happening in our local school, or the diocese might be involved in something there. So we want to bring the energies that already exist into our planning too. So it's a bit of research and listening in that stage to ensure that we're not going to trample over good efforts, or if the efforts weren't that great, to at least honour them and learn from them. Then some of the things we are familiar with, but it's interesting, a lot of people start at step 7 when they plan, and that's what we're saying. No, there's a few steps before that. Actions, resources, timeframes, very exciting. A lot of people then really don't only do step 7. So I think it is good, and a lot of people have been saying this here tonight and last week about reviewing and measuring outcomes, setting KPIs. People think it's a bit hard to do, isn't it, with pastoral initiatives? But it actually isn't. There's some actual good processes that can help you measure your outcomes. And that's really important to be able to do, because otherwise we can't really give thanks and celebrate, which is an important part too. We can't get to a point of saying, we did actually achieve it. In pastoral life, we know there's so much we want to do, and we can feel quite despondent at times that we haven't achieved much. But if we set these goals, this vision for ourselves, and as a pastoral council, as you can hear there, monitoring an overview of it, but perhaps establishing these groups that can look at key actions, resources, timeframes, etc. That's where we can then give thanks and celebrate our achievements. And of course, we then look at moving the cycle all over again. So it gives us a bit of just a taste of that planning cycle. Some of us will be very familiar with that, and others may have not experienced it. So many approaches that we've seen over time, but we'll just pause there again. And Lisa, is there just any feedback coming through from people in terms of what's been happening there?
Yes. Again, lots of awareness about, the questions. What are the questions we need to form when going out to the community and sharing with them? So that's wonderful. A question about the need for training for our people who are taking on roles of executive, particularly. People don't know how to run reading meetings, or they might not have that experience if they take on these roles. And that's something I know that we can touch on next week, and we can send information about that. But also next year, our office hopes to run monthly pastoral council formation, just on different aspects, because in these 3 weeks, we're only going to skim the surface of pastoral councils. There's so much information to do with that as well. But yeah, that's a very good point about the training and formation needed for people to be able to run effective meetings as well. Yeah, that's about the gist of it right now.
Okay, so I think that area of running effective meetings is a key one, and there's certainly some. We've got different sheets. There's lots of information. It's not just, of course, from what we provide, but you can find out some best practices for minute takers, best practices for chairs, etc., through wonderful YouTube videos, etc. But certainly we've got some cheat sheets for people on those roles as well. And one of the things we sometimes do with newly formed executives is we just have a meeting with them and with the executive itself and talk about their role in detail, because it's such a significant role, isn't it, in the life of any group, to ensure that they really know what they're doing. A good chair is essential, isn't it, for any meeting, as so as good minutes, etc. So, and what they do between meetings is vital. Has There's another question here. How do we share this info with priests, especially if they don't want to counsel? So we've been talking about this a little bit, haven't we? And one of the things is that we're, as a pastoral planning office, will already in discussions with the vicar for clergy, Wim Hoekstra, about the idea of, well, actually it was Ron McFarlane, about the idea of sharing with clergy, doing sessions like this with them on like a clergy formation day. So that's some of the work, and certainly in the first seminary, we're going to be invited in soon to start doing some work there with, so for new priests. But it doesn't perhaps help with your own priest. And that's what I said earlier. Sometimes it's about, I find, we start off with a meal. We've got to actually start with a relationship with these good people that are with us. And they usually have had perhaps a bad experience. And we want to listen to them first and hear, what is it about the councils that they don't like? And then we might find we agree with them that, yeah, we probably wouldn't like that sort of council too. And we can start talking about some of the things that we've shared here, and maybe it is inviting us or other people out, or a parish that's had a good experience of council, and get the priest to talk to one of their fellow priests about it. Remembering that priests sometimes have only had 2 or 3 experiences of a pastoral council in their lives, because once they become a priest and have any opportunity to form a council, they will usually only do it in the way they understand a council is operated. So we really want to offer them different models, unless they've had the opportunity to explore different models, and then they will bring that in. And another question that's come is, how open to formation are members of the council and leadership groups? So I'm not sure what we're talking about there. I think I understand it though, in terms of, I know that sometimes people sort of roll their eyes at the word formation, or they think we're too busy, you know, we've got too much to do. And this just seems to be, this discernment or formation or prayer time is eating into the work we could be doing. So that gets back to our model, our why and our what, and taking that time to actually think about, why are we on the council and what's the council for? Because if it's about getting a lot of things done, I'd suggest that's what's either a very different form of council, and therefore you may not need all that formation, but it's not what we're talking about here tonight. So it gets back to, what's the purpose of the council in the first place? And that can be the beginning of that conversation. People don't understand why they need to do formation, because they don't understand the purpose of it sometimes. So we need to go back. For readers, I know for lectors, sometimes that question comes up, why do I have to attend the formation for the ministers of the word? I already know how to read. And they hear the word formation as training, or they hear the word formation as something which is like, he's saying I'm not smart enough already, or I know how to do this. So it depends on where people are coming from, but in there you can say, well, actually, what we're saying, formation for ministry of the word, can invite us into a beautiful space of, how do we pray the word, you know, and how can we share that word of prayer with one another? So that helps in that ministry. And the formation for council is supposed to be integral to how we conduct our role. That's the oxygen we will breathe in as part of what we're doing. So that's I think we'll end there tonight, because we've hit 9 o'clock. And so what we've ended tonight was just we've given you a very information heavy session, as you've experienced. We'll give you some extra sheets on everything that we have shared tonight. But what we want to do next week is that we'll be sending certainly the slides through. We will send through that extra information. We encourage you to have a read through, and then we're going to be popping out a little of a survey, a bit of a poll, and hearing about what you particularly want us to focus on in our final week. And we will certainly be opening that up to the shared wisdom then of you, in terms of having longer time for these breakout sessions, and we'll be gathering that wisdom back in. So it's really going to be a lot more over to you next week, but we put this information in so we've at least got a shared space to bounce that out of, a shared experience of what you've encountered, to either disagree with, add to, and share your examples. So thank you very much for your participation tonight. We do hope it is of some help in your own journey. We're recognising, as Lisa says, we're jumping across the pond, but we hoping that we at least are creating a space of reflection for yourselves and some inspiration to bring back to your own communities. So God bless you. Good night, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.